There we go. So it's good to have you here. Any of you who are watching this recording later on, we're going to begin with the opening prayer as we move into the second part of the Crossways materials that picks up from the conquest almost to the time of the exile. But on page 2 in part 2 of your student book, we have a prayer. Let's join together. Gracious and caring God, we thank you for enabling your people of old to survive in a challenging wilderness and for bringing them to the land of their hopes and dreams. We praise you for leading us, your people today, through the wilderness of this world, for providing the needs of our spirit and body, and for enabling us to do meaningful things with our life. We commit our todays and tomorrows into your loving and caring hands. We thank you for forgiving us what we are and for inspiring us to become more of what you would have us be. And above all else, we glorify you for assuring that when we cross that final Jordan, you will be waiting to embrace us in grace and to welcome us into our eternal home. We ask these things in the name of your Son, Jesus the Messiah, whose eyes we shall see, whose voice we shall hear, and whose presence we will share, world without end. Amen. So I will find a way to get this up on the screen now the right way. Here we go. So covering the last unit on page 138 in your previous book, this is always one of those, Ken said, hey, next time I'm just going to take a picture of my phone, then I'll have it on my phone. I won't have to drag the book along. But we've got some illustrations to review. So if somebody would read 10A on page 138.
The Jacob clan most likely settled in Egypt at a time when it was ruled by non-Egyptians known as Hyksos. Several centuries later, their descendants were enslaved by a pharaoh who knew nothing about the services Jacob's son Joseph had rendered to the Egyptians. The Egyptian rulers pressed the Israelites into labor gangs and forced them to work in the fields and to make bricks and mortar for their building projects. God raised up Moses, called him at Mount Sinai, and used him in a series of events, confrontation with the Pharaoh, 10 plagues, that eventually enabled Moses to lead the Israelites out of Egypt into the Sinai Peninsula. Debate continues concerning the route of the wilderness wanderings. It is difficult to determine the precise location of the many place names referred to in narratives in Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The Israelites rebelled, murmured, and grumbled repeatedly during their 40-year journey.
And somebody read the bullet points for us.
While Moses was meeting with God on Mount Sinai, Aaron and the people made and worshipped a golden calf. The people complained about the lack of food and water. Some objected to Moses's role as sole leader and to his being married to a Cushite woman. Questions were raised about the priestly authority conferred on Moses and his descendants. 10 of the spies sent to survey the promised land came back with a negative report about the possibility of conquering its inhabitants. A subsequent feeble attempt to conquer the land failed, and the wanderers were told that they would have to spend 40 years in the wilderness.
All right, so lots of detail captured in this illustration, which is just trying to give a rough sense of the wandering period through the wilderness. Again, as you see at the section that would be the Mediterranean Sea gets used for other things. So there's just kind of a snapshot of some people carrying some earthly goods and wandering, and then all these place names, the numbers correspond to the various parts you see on the red here, even though it's agreed that we aren't always sure where every one of these spots might happen to be. But this is just an idea of God leading them through the wilderness. You see the pillar of cloud, on the right, the pillar of fire on the left. You see, and we'll spend more time with this bottom part of the picture with the covenant at Mount Sinai as we look at Deuteronomy today, and eventually wandering through and almost getting ready to enter in the promised land, which is actually what our lesson will be the next time we get together. So any questions on this one? All right, 10B doesn't have a picture that go with it, but somebody could read that nonetheless.
Rulers of the Edomites, Moabites, Amorites, and other groups living to the east of the Jordan River, did all they could to block the progress of the Israelites and wage war against them. When Balak, king of the Moab, sought to have Balaam, a seer for Mesopotamia, curse Israel, Balaam eventually declared that he could not curse Israel. He could only bless it. Somebody else can go from there.
The Israelites managed to prevail over all their opponents and eventually encamped on the east bank of the Jordan River. However, while there, they participated in sexual rituals associated with the worship of the fertility god Baal. God persisted in patient grace and eventually brought the Israelites to the east bank of the Jordan River. To the west lay Jericho. The hopes and dreams of many years were about to be fulfilled.
And so that really catches us on this from sort of 12, 13, 14, 15. Many of those activities took place at that place. And so we'll pick up on that. It's especially referenced the fertility religions. That's what the final part of 10C is about, if someone wants to take that one.
In Egypt, where the Nile could be tapped for irrigation, the Israelites had access to a sure supply of water for both personal and pastoral needs. Because no such water supply system existed in the Promised Land, many within Israel sought rain for their crops and pastures through the practice of rituals associated with Baal worship. The goal was to ensure fertility of both soil and womb. Scholars suggest that prior to Judah being taken into exile in Babylon in 587 BC, 90% of the Israelites worshiped the Baals 90% of the time.
Yeah. So we're getting this picture is going to repeat in terms of we'll bump into its reality for the next several sessions. And really this whole next section, this is going to be a part of the problem. And so they just, when they got to that so-called Baal of Peor place, and that's when this first connection with the Canaanite fertility religions began to occur. It's going to unfortunately rear its head all the way through the subsequent history that we're going to be following. And the thinking is this, that human beings can perform rituals, can do things that somehow influence the gods. And of course, in this picture, you may think back even to your classes on Greek or Roman mythology. The gods of the nations are often pictured as superhuman and kind of personified in those anthropomorphic ways. And so you have male and female gods and goddesses. And the more classic one is the male sky god and the female earth god, and the understanding that when it is raining, that's when the male sky god is inseminating the female earth god, which of course leads to the produce of grain and all life, right? And if there's no rain, there will be no crops. And if there's no crops, there will be no food. And if there's no food, there will be no life. So it's understood as this kind of cycle there. And even if we want to disregard that kind of what we would probably describe as a primitive way of thinking, the reality is we still fall prey to the thinking that we can somehow influence God. And we'll see some pictures that do that. But that's why there's a check mark here on the crop and an X out on the covenant, because it's not as if those ancient civilizations didn't have covenants. It's not as if those ancient civilizations didn't have laws and regulations and rules for living life and things like that. They would. And again, going back to your own history, you might remember Hammurabi's Code, which was a famous Mesopotamian document used lightly, stone tablet found. So it is there, but it's just not part of what their religious life is like. So can you manipulate God?
Why? So like Moses a number of times influences God not to kill the people.
You can have conversation, right? But the idea that somehow, some way, I can do something that makes God do something back. It's that direct connection. That's the problem. It's not as if we can't pray to God, please, but it's this sense of not thinking that God is, I like to say, some kind of divine vending machine. And as long as we put in the proper amount of money and punch the right buttons, we get from the vending machine what we want. That's the thing. But yeah, you will have dialogue and conversation, and you'll even get some of those passages that, depending where people are at with their theological thinking in place, have difficulty, where it talks about God changing his mind. Or even in one passage, depending on the translation, some Bibles don't make it this clear, but we'll talk about God repented of that. Not repented as of having done something wrong, but repented as in changing thinking on, because that's what repentance really means, to change the way you think. So, but can we do things that manipulate the God? No. And again, we want to flip it. We want to say, hey, God, because I do this, therefore you do that. That doesn't work. We need to yield to God. We need to submit to God. And so ultimately, the Bible will put a big cancel X on this kind of thinking, but we're going to see it repeat itself over and over and over. So much so that that very last sentence on 10C is where we go. Sort of this sense that 90% of the Israelites worship the Baals 90% of the time. So, well, then they'd worship God. So, all right. So that kind of covers the end of the last section. Oh, I got to get going here. So we are now going to jump into the book of Deuteronomy. And so you can put the first section of materials away and pull out the next one. And this is a fascinating book, right? Remember that in the Jewish structure of the Bible, the first part is called the law. And that's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. A fancy word you may have heard, Pentateuch, right? 5 books, or really even 5 scrolls. This is the law. And whenever the New Testament refers to law, it could very well be meaning this. In fact, sometimes when the New Testament refers to Moses, it's not referring to Moses, the man, but these are, in most English Bibles will say, the first book of Moses, commonly called Genesis, the second book of Moses. So even though there's no direct passage any place that says Moses wrote that, it's been attributed to him through the Jewish tradition, and then that's been passed on to the Christian tradition as well. So Mosaic law will be another way of describing those first 5 books. Yeah, that phrase. Yep, you'll see that too. So, but this is the formative part of the Hebrew Bible. And we will be working with that. And then we're going to journey through the beginning of the prophetic writings, Joshua through 2 Kings, with what's left in this second part of the materials. We'll revisit all those things when we go back the prophets a little bit later. But so Deuteronomy is a big deal. Remember, here in our timeline, we've been kind of following our way through. So here's Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. Then comes that sojourn in Egypt. They move down into Egypt, and eventually they are enslaved, but that slavery is broken. And now God has led them through the wilderness, and they're perched on the edge of the promised land. And one of the interesting things with Deuteronomy, and your text will mention that, is even though it goes Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, you'd sort of expect that they've gotten all the way through, perched, ready to cross over, that Deuteronomy would be the book where they cross over. It isn't. Deuteronomy is laid out as a farewell address from Moses to the Israelites. And again, all the debates that people have about the Bible, what is interesting is Deuteronomy actually fits better with what comes after it than it fits with what comes before it. Because it's, at least in terms of its narrative flow, the narrative stops and stays. It's like, okay, it's like a big pause. And I liken it sometimes to the speech that a mom or dad or whomever might make to their son or daughter getting ready to go off far away to college, right? It's sort of a delightful, fun, exciting time if you've experienced that, but it's also like nervous because it's like, okay, whatever limited control I may have had in my child's life is soon going to be relinquished once they take off, right? And so it's this extended conversation, but that's what's happening here in our timeline. And so that brings us to this picture, and we're actually going to come back to this picture because we're going to spend time first in the book. So I'm going to pause my slideshow here for a minute, and we will come back. So open up to the book of Deuteronomy. We will not have time to read through all 34 chapters, but we will get a chance to do some representative things. And if you want, pages 7 and 8 in your textbook might help us, because we're going to do a little bit of skimming as we work our way through. All right. Somebody read Deuteronomy chapter 1, the first 5 verses.
These are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel beyond the Jordan, in the wilderness on the plain opposite Suf, between Paran and Tophel, Laban, Hazeroth, and the.
Yeah, there you go.
Mount S. It takes 11 days to reach K from Horeb. In the 40th year, on the first day of the 11th month, Moses spoke to the Israelites just as the Lord had commanded him to speak to them. This was after he had defeated King Sihon of the Amorites, who reigned in Aish, and King Og of Bashan, who reigned in A and in E, beyond the Jordan in the land of Moab. Moses undertook to expound this law as follows.
Okay, so kind of a little bit of a lengthy introduction, and good for you just reading most of those letters there, and we're going to run across several. A few things that need to be mentioned. The way that Deuteronomy speaks about Mount Sinai is using the word Mount Horeb, and you'll hear that later. So Horeb and Sinai are the same place, okay? And in verse 1 and again in verse 5, your Bible translation might have the phrase beyond the Jordan. But others of yours might say east of the Jordan, right? So just show of hands. Who has beyond the Jordan? Okay. And who has east? Yeah. What's the difference? Well, the Hebrew literally says beyond the Jordan. The trouble, quote unquote, with that literal translation is if you really want to insist that Deuteronomy is written by Moses, beyond the Jordan is what you talk about from when you're on the other side. And Moses doesn't get to the other side. Right? And so sometimes, and that's just something to be aware of, that the translating is usually a team, it's occasionally an individual, but usually our Bibles are translated by a team of scholars. And the broader the team, the harder it is to cancel out your own personal biases, or the easier it is to cancel out those biases. The smaller the team, the easier it is to perpetuate those biases. And so sometimes as you just become aware of, is this I don't like these words, but is this translated by a more conservative team? Then it's going to always translate words that support the conservative viewpoint. Or if it's translated by a more quote unquote liberal team, then it's always going to translate the words that make it easier to support the viewpoint of the literal or liberal team. Got it? So that's part of the challenge. But just so you see it there. But it is this sort of introduction that talks about it in the third person, but quickly shifts to the first, right? Because it says, these are the words that Moses spoke, rather than, for example, these are the words that I spoke. And so it's all sort of set up, right? After they've defeated verse 4, King Sihon, after they've defeated King Og, they're on that other side of the Jordan, ready to get in. Here's what kicks in. So keep reading, please, 6 through 8.
When we were at Mount Sinai, the Lord our God said to us, "You have stayed at this mountain long enough. It is time to break camp and move on. Go to the hill country of the Amorites and to all the neighboring regions, the Jordan Valley, the hill country and the western foothills, the Negev and the coastal plain. Go to the land of the Canaanites and to Lebanon and all the way to the great Euphrates River. Look, I am giving all this land to you. Go in and occupy it, for it is the land the Lord swore to give to your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and to all their descendants."
Okay. Do you hear anything in that passage? That any bells ring? Any little lights go off? The Lord spoke to us. This is who I am. This is what I've done, right? It's a little bit of a historical prologue, right? Kind of setting the stage. And now you've got us. The Lord spoke to us, right? And kind of making that there. But now look what happens. Somebody else take 9 through 18.
At that time I said to you, I am unable by myself to bear you. The Lord your God has multiplied you, so that today you are as numerous as the stars of heaven. May the Lord, the God of your ancestors, increase you 1,000 times more and bless you as he has promised you. But how can I bear the heavy burden of your disputes all by myself? Choose for each of your tribes individuals who are wise, discerning, and reputable to be your leaders. You answer me, the plan you have proposed is a good one. So I took the leaders of your tribes, wise and reputable individuals, and installed them as leaders over you, commanders of thousands, commanders of hundreds, commanders of 50s, commanders of 10s, and officials throughout your tribes. I charged your judges at that time, give the members of your community a fair hearing, and judge rightly between one person and another, whether citizen or resident alien. You must not be partial in judging. Hear out the small and the great alike. You shall not be intimidated by anyone, for the judgment is God's. Any case that is too hard for you, bring to me, and I will hear it. So I charged you at that time with all the things that you should do.
So again, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, comes to him after viewing how Moses is sort of leading the group and saying, you're on a burnout course. If you keep trying to do all this stuff yourself, you're going to fry. So choose people who can lead. And so they're kind of describing that portion, right? And then as they move from there, verse 19 tells us that they set out from Horeb. They went through that quote unquote great and terrible wilderness, right? That's described as a very difficult, hard place. You came to Kadesh Barnea, you've reached that hill country, and they send spies, right? Somebody pick up verse 22 through 25.
But you responded, first, let's send out scouts to explore the land for us. They will advise us on the best route to take and decide which towns we should capture. This seems like a good idea to me. So I chose 12 scouts, one from each of your tribes. They crossed into the hills and came to the valley of Vishal and explored it. They picked up some of its fruit and brought it back to us, and they reported that the land the Lord our God had given us was indeed a good land.
Okay, That's part of the spies report. What was the other part? You remember? Yeah, the people are giants, right? We felt like grasshoppers. There's no way we can do this. And 10 of the 12 give that negative report. And it's only Caleb and Joshua who give a positive report. And that gets picked up. Keep going through verse 33.
But you rebelled against the command of the Lord your God and refused to go in. You murmured and complained in your tents and said, the Lord must hate us, bringing us here from Egypt to be slaughtered by these Amorites. How can we go on? Our scouts have demoralized us with their report. They say that the people of the land are taller and more powerful than we are, and that the walls of their towns rise high into the sky. They have even seen giants there, the descendants of Anak. But I said to you, don't be afraid. The Lord your God is going before you. He will fight for you, just as you saw him do in Egypt. And you saw how the Lord your God cared for you again and again here in the wilderness, just as a father cares for his child. Now he has brought you to this place, but even after all he did, you refused to trust the Lord your God. Read 33.
Yeah.
And who goes before you looking for the best places to camp, guiding you by pillar of fire at night and a pillar of cloud by day?
Okay. They're not going to do it. The next section talks about then how, as a result of that, they're going to wander 40 years. And essentially everyone who was above 20 years old when they came out of Egypt will die. None of them are going to get to go into the promised land, the exception being Caleb and Joshua. And that's what really comes next. Of course, the people say, oh, let's go attack. They can't do it. They're repelled. And that really takes us down to the end of chapter 1. Okay. And then in chapter 2, it begins to talk about what comes after that as they begin to work their way up on the other side of the Jordan to go into the land. And by the end of chapter 2, they've defeated King Sihon. The beginning of chapter 3, they get King Og. And so that again is a summary of what we just read at the end of the last unit. Okay. With me so far in chapter 3? And then in at beginning chapter 3, verse 23, Moses gets an opportunity to take a peek at the promised land. Somebody read that. Finish that chapter 3.
At that time, I pleaded with the Lord and said, O sovereign Lord, you have only begun to show your greatness and the strength of your hand to me, your servant. Is there any God in heaven or on earth who can perform such great and mighty deeds as you do? Please let me cross the Jordan to see the wonderful land on the other side, the beautiful hill country and the Lebanon mountains. But the Lord was angry with me because of you, and he would not listen to me. That's enough, he declared. Speak of it no more, but go up to Peak and look over the land in every direction. Take a good look, but you may not cross the Jordan River. Instead, commission Joshua and encourage and strengthen him, for he will lead the people across the Jordan. He will give them all the land you now see before you as their possession. So we stayed in the valley near that fort.
Okay, so Moses here says, God, please, will you change your mind? Can I go in? And God's answer, no. Who's going to take over? Joshua. So you've got that kind of set up. And so now comes some of the distinctive Deuteronomic, and that did you know you can turn Deuteronomy into an adjective? We'll bump into several of those. Mosaic would be another one that was referenced earlier, but the Deuteronomic language. Somebody read verses 1 through 4 of chapter 4.
Now Israel, hear the decrees and laws I'm about to teach you. Follow them so that you may live and may go in and take possession of the land that the Lord, the God of your ancestors, is giving you. Do not add to what I command you, and do not subtract from it, but keep the commands of the Lord your God that I give you. You saw with your own eyes what the Lord did at Baal Peor, The Lord your God destroyed from among you everyone who followed the Baal of Peor. But all of you who held fast to the Lord your God are still alive today.
So up until this point, it's been a long description of what kind of their story has been. And now, if you will, we start bumping into the stipulations, right? This is who I am. This is what I've done for you. This is what I expect of you. So you can see how Deuteronomy is a covenant book. And your translation, mine, for example, in verse 1 says statutes and ordinances. Natalie, you just read, what was yours? Decrees and laws. What else do you have? Laws and regulations. Anything else? So you're gonna, whatever your Bible translates those phrases at, you're gonna see those repeating over and over and over again. That's one of the things. Everybody have commandments in verse 2? Keep the commandments of the Lord. Is that what you have? Everybody? Oh, commands. Okay, commands or commandments. We'll see that, right? I'll read next here. It says, see, just as the Lord my God has charged me, I now teach you statutes and ordinances. You've probably got whatever words you had before. I teach you statutes and ordinances, I can't even say it, S&O, for you to observe in the land that you are about to enter and occupy. You must observe them diligently. For this will show your wisdom and discernment to the peoples, who, when they hear all these statutes, will say, surely this great nation is a wise and discerning people. That kind of thinking, again, will be repeated over and over and over again in our subsequent books. The idea that the way you live is a witness and a testimony to the God you follow. They will say, let's see, verse 7, for what other great nation has a God so near to it as the Lord our God is whenever we call to him? And what other great nation has statutes and ordinances as just as this entire law that I am setting before you today? And now another phrase that will come up, somebody 9 through 14.
Take care and watch yourselves closely so as to neither forget the things that your eyes have seen, nor to let them slip from your mind all the days of your life. Make them known to your children and your children's children, how you once stood before the Lord your God at Horeb, when the Lord said to me, assemble the people before me, and I will let them hear my words, so that they may learn to fear me as long as they live on the earth, and may teach their children so. You approached and stood at the foot of the mountain, while the mountain was blazing up at the very heavens, shrouded in dark clouds. Then the Lord spoke to you, and out of the fire you heard the sound of words, but saw no form. There was only a voice. He declared to you his covenant, which he charged you to observe, that is, the 10 commandments, and he wrote them on 2 stone tablets. And the Lord charged me at that time to teach you statutes and ordinances for you to observe in the land that you are about to cross into and occupy.
Okay, and I'm going to, for just a minute, pull up our illustration here. Because one of the things that's interesting, and again, we'll spend more time with this as soon as I get this to hide and go away, is here at the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula is Mount Sinai, Mount Horeb. And here's that image of the clouds and the lightning, right? That awesome presence of God. There you see that yellow form of the covenant, and then the 6 parts would be 6 dots, except the third part is the stipulation, so they put law codes there instead. And then you see the tabernacle down in the midst of that, which they built, and then these circles represent the people. So this is all geographically where it is. But notice up here where this narrative of Deuteronomy is taking place, you have, if you will, a shadow image of that same Mount Sinai. And in fact, let's see, I got a couple of places in the text. On page 5, point 2, final paragraph, about 2 lines up. It says, although Mount Sinai was located on the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula, it was also in a real sense present wherever they were. So that's what he's trying to convey in this picture. And then flip to the next page on page 6. In that first full paragraph there, second sentence says, God's people are always to remember that the awesome presence they first saw at Sinai is a continuing presence. So here's this sense that as Moses is speaking to the people, they are to remember and remember. For the Hebrew, in the Bible, remember is not just a recall. It's not just a mental exercise. It is a participation exercise. They are to member themselves again. And so still today, Jewish people who practice their faith will talk about all these things that we're reading about happening to us. It's not just happening to our ancestors, it's happening to us. It's that connection that's there. And in the Western world, which is, well, obviously where most of us have lived and grown and been educated, we don't necessarily think about it in that same sort of way. Because we think much more individualistic instead of communal and historical down through the ages. We get a teeny bit of that, sort of like the old battle cry, remember the Alamo, even though everybody at the Alamo was killed. So nobody could remember what happened in that sense, but you recall it, right? Or a football coach or whatever, a sports coach might, if 2 teams are finally meeting in the playoffs and they haven't met for 10 years, they might say, remember what they did to us last time, even though nobody on the team was there the last time. It's that reconnecting. And so that shows up here again and again and again. And this kind of sense that God is continuing to be with us. So we'll come back to our illustration some more, but let's go back to the text. So 15 picks up and says, you saw no form when the Lord spoke, but take care, watch yourselves closely so that you do not act corruptly by making an idol for yourself, right? Don't make idols. And it goes on to say, you can't make these images of anything, right? Verse 19, when you look up to the heaven and see the sun, the moon, and the stars, all the host of heaven, those are just lights, as it mentioned in Genesis chapter 1. Do not bow down to them. Do not be led astray to serve them. Like and the inference is like the surrounding nations do. There is this distinctiveness there. Okay. And in fact, in a personal sort of confession way, verse 21, he says, the Lord was angry with me because of you, and he vowed that I should not cross the Jordan, that I should not enter the good land. For I'm going to die in this land without crossing, but you're going to cross over. So look at verse 23. So be careful not to forget the covenant that the Lord your God made with you. And goes on, now don't make yourself an idol, right? This warning about worshiping false gods. And then a rather terrifying sort of phrase, verse 24. I haven't had a confirmation student choose this yet for their life verse. For the Lord your God is a devouring fire, a jealous God. Right? Somebody pick up 25 through 31.
When you have had children and children's children and become complacent in the land, if you act corruptly by making an idol in the form of anything, thus doing what is evil in the sight of the Lord your God, and provoking him to anger, I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that you will soon utterly perish in the land that you are crossing the Jordan to occupy. You will not live long on it, but will be utterly destroyed. The Lord will scatter you among the people. Only a few of you will be left among the nations where the Lord will lead you.
There you will serve other gods made by human hands, objects of wood and stone that neither see, nor hear, nor eat, nor smell. And there you will seek the Lord your God, and you will find him if you search after him with all your heart and soul. In your distress, when all these things have happened to you in time to come, you will return to the Lord your God and heed him. Because the Lord your God is a merciful God, he will neither abandon you nor destroy you. He will not forget the covenant with your ancestors that he swore to them.
Again, if you know the story, you know that's exactly what they're going to do and exactly what's going to happen. And to me, I don't have a strong stake either way. I can see in a passage like this how those who want to take it in its most literal sense as the writings and words of Moses spoken to the people in that moment before they crossed the Jordan, being prophetic about what will happen if bad things happen. And I can also understand from the viewpoint of those who say these words are written after that all those things have happened to set and tell them why they happened and to show them now going forward why they need to be different than their ancestors were. Both of those seem to have some sense that they make to me. But there is this idea of, how long do you get to keep the land? Well, the land isn't yours forever if you just behave in ways that don't honor God, right? And did you hear, I call heaven and earth to witness again? There's the witnesses. And you get the blessings and the curses, primarily the curse side in here. And if you got a chance to read through the book of Deuteronomy, I hope you had fun with chapter 28, which has lots of curses in it. But anyway, we'll get a chance to skim some of those. But also, even in the midst of judgment, there will be mercy, right? There will be grace. And so that is important. Somebody take 32 to 39. Or I guess 40, actually.
Now search all of history from the time God created people on the earth until now, and search from one end of the heavens to the other. Has anything as great as this ever been seen or heard before? Has any nation ever heard the voice of God speaking from fire as you did and survived? Has any other God dared to take a nation for himself out of another nation by means of trials, miraculous signs, wonders, war, a strong hand, a powerful arm, and terrifying acts? Yet that is what the Lord your God did for you in Egypt right before your eyes. He showed you these things so you would know that the Lord is God, there is no other. He let you hear his voice from heaven so he could instruct you. He let you see the great fire here on earth so he could speak to you from it. Because he loved your ancestors, he chose to bless their descendants. And he personally brought you out of Egypt with a great display of power. He drove out nations far greater than you so he could bring you in and give you their land for your special possession as it is today. So remember this and keep it firmly in mind. The Lord is God, but the Lord is God both in heaven and on earth, and there is no other. If you obey all the decrees and commands I am giving you today, all will be well with you and your children. I am giving you these instructions so that you will enjoy a long life in the land the Lord your God is giving you for all time.
And again, depending on how you read it, and you had past tense in yours where it says he drove out, right? I mean, that hasn't happened yet. So how it all fits, but you get the sense of that it's an interesting word that gets used, how Israel is called to be a peculiar people, a distinct people, a separate people. And remember, the word holy really means set apart, more so than it means sinless. And we usually think of holy as sinless, but to be a holy people, people set apart. God chose you out of, and historically, again, it just starts to look around. Nobody else is talking about themselves in this way. That God has chosen you for this purpose. And God is going to use you in this way. So this is what's coming. The end of chapter 4 talks about these cities of refuge, and we've run across those earlier in the text, that there are cities that are going to be chosen, that if an accidental murder or death occurs, people have a place to flee so they can avoid the vengeance that will come. And that's then the first 4 chapters, with the exception of the last little section that we'll look at here in a minute. But that's the first part of number 1 on page 7. Okay, so this on pages 7 and 8, it is not a exhaustive outline, but it's a very simple outline. And now we get kind of another introduction to what's coming. Somebody read 44 through the end of the chapter.
This is the law that Moses set before the Israelites. These are the decrees and the statutes and ordinances that Moses spoke to the Israelites when they had come out of Egypt, beyond the Jordan, in the valley opposite Bee, on the land of King Sihon of the Amorites, who reigned at Heshbon, whom Moses and the Israelites defeated when they came out of Egypt. They occupied his land and the land of King Og of Bashan, and 2 kings of the Amorites on the eastern side of the Jordan, from which is on the east edge, which is on the edge of the Wadi Aram, as far as Mount Hermon, together with all the on the east side of the Jordan, as far as the sea of the under the slopes of Pete.
It sounds like a math problem, doesn't it? But if you go back and look at the opening words of chapter 1, they're very similar, right? So it's just kind of a repeating. We're setting the stage. And now chapter 5 is why Deuteronomy is called Deuteronomy. Because anima is the word for law, deutero, the word for 2. This is the second giving of the law. So somebody can have the delight of reading chapter 5, verses 1 through 21.
Moses called all the people of Israel together and said, "Listen carefully to all the laws and regulations I am giving you today. Learn them and be sure to obey them. While we were at Mount Sinai, the Lord your God made a covenant with us. The Lord did not make this covenant long ago with our ancestors, but with all of us who are alive today. The Lord spoke to you face to face from the heart of the fire in the mountain. I stood as an intermediary between you and the Lord, for you were afraid of the fire and did not climb the mountain. He spoke to me, and I passed his words on to you, and this is what he said. I am the Lord your God, who rescued you from slavery in Egypt. Do not worship any other gods besides me. Do not make idols of any kind, whether in the shape of birds or animals or fish. You must never worship or bow down to them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God who will not share your affection with any other God. I do not leave unpunished the sins of those who hate me, but I punish the children for the sins of their parents to the 3rd and 4th generations. But I lavish my love on those who love me and obey my commands, even for 1,000 generations. Do not misuse the name of the Lord your God. The Lord will not let you go unpunished if you misuse his name. Observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy, as the Lord your God has commanded you. 6 days a week are set apart for your daily duties and regular work. But the 7th day is a day of rest dedicated to the Lord your God. On that day, no one in your household may do any kind of work. This includes you, your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, your oxen and donkeys, and other livestock, and any foreigners living among you. All your male and female servants must rest as you do. Remember that you were once slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out with amazing power and mighty deeds. That is why the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. Honor your father and mother, as the Lord your God commanded you. Then you will live a long, full life in the land the Lord your God will give you. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not testify falsely against your neighbor. Do not covet your neighbor's wife. Do not covet your neighbor's house or land, male or female servant, ox or donkey, or anything else your neighbor owns.
Okay. And we looked at those briefly last time. Interesting. They're very similar. The covenant commandments are flip-flopped. In Exodus, it talks about don't covet your neighbor's house. Then it goes on to say don't covet your neighbor's wife. Here it's flipped the other way. And interestingly, with the commandment regarding the Sabbath day, here it says you were slaves in Egypt. You had to work. That's why God gave you the Sabbath. But in the Exodus version, it says there were 7 days, 6 days of creation. God rested on the seventh. So he hallowed the seventh day. But here's the giving of the law a second time. Okay. Let's see. Somebody take 22 through 27.
These words the Lord spoke with a loud voice to your whole assembly at the mountain out of the fire, the cloud, and the thick darkness, and he added no more. He wrote them on 2 stone tablets and gave them to me. When you heard the voice out of the darkness, while the mountain was burning with fire, you approached me, all the heads of your tribes and your elders, and you said, look, the Lord our God has shown us his glory and greatness, and we have heard his voice out of the fire. Today we have seen that God may speak to someone, and the person may still live. So now why should we die? For this great fire will consume us. If we hear the voice of the Lord our God any longer, we shall die. For who is there of all flesh that has heard the voice of the living God speaking out of the fire as we have and remained alive? Go near you yourselves and hear all that the Lord our God will say. Then tell us everything that the Lord our God tells you, and we will listen and do it.
Okay. We're not sure if people hear God, they're going to live. So you just go listen, right? You do it. And if you survive, you can tell. It's a little more than that, of course, but it is somewhat humorous. Go ahead and finish the chapter.
The Lord heard your words when you spoke to me, and the Lord said to me, I have heard the words of this people which they have spoken to you. They are right in all that they have spoken. If only they had such a mind as this, to fear me and to keep all my commandments always, so that it might go well with them and with their children forever. Go say to them, return to your tents, but you stand here by me, and I will tell you all the commandments, the statutes and the ordinances that you shall teach them, so that they may do them in the land that I am giving them to possess. You must therefore be careful to do as the Lord your God has commanded you. You shall not turn to the right or to the left. You must follow exactly the path that the Lord your God has commanded you, so that you may live, and that it may go well with you, and that you may live long in the land that you are to possess.
So that last part again will be something that gets repeated. Don't turn from the right to the left. Make sure that you do what he has commanded, so that you may live, so that it may go well with you, that you may live a long time in the land. Those are phrases that get repeated in many different ways throughout the book of Deuteronomy. Chapter 6 might be one of the better known chapters. Would somebody read the first 9 verses?
These are the commands, decrees, and regulations that the Lord your God commanded me to teach you. You must obey them in the land you are about to enter and occupy, and you and your children and grandchildren must fear the Lord your God as long as you live. If you obey all his decrees and commands, you will enjoy a long life. Listen closely, Israel, and be careful to obey. Then all will go well with you, and you will have many children in the land flowing with milk and honey, just as the Lord, the God of your ancestors, promised you.
Here's some of those themes. Keep going.
Listen, O Israel, the Lord is our God and the Lord alone. And you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your strength. And you must commit yourselves wholeheartedly to these commands that I am giving you today. Repeat them again and again to your children. Talk about them when you are at home and when you are on the road, and when you are going to bed and when you are getting up. Tie them to your hands and wear them on your forehead as reminders. Write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates.
You very likely have a footnote at the end of verse 4. And if you look at the footnote, you'll see there are multiple ways those words could be rendered. This and not to sound stuffy, but this passage is known as the Great Shema, which is the first word in there. Shema Israel. Hear, O Israel. So if you ever run, and it's usually spelled Shema, and lots of times when a word from a foreign language is written, it'll be in italics. So if you ever see SH, and it's often a capital, SHEMA in italics, this is the passage it's referring to, right? This is, and you might even in your Bible might even have a section. This is the great commandment. And we've heard it. We'll get it a little different in the New Testament, because instead of just being with your heart, with your soul, with your might, you'll also get with your mind, right? But this is love the Lord your God, right? This is the command. But this declaration, hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. Someday, if you want to learn a little Hebrew phrase, that wouldn't be a bad one to do. Shema Israel, Elohe, Adonai Elohe Echad. I mean, it's a very well-honored Jewish phrase and Jewish prayer and Jewish call to center themselves in this one God, right? And then the command, of course, verses 6 through following, to pass it on. This is not something that you receive and hang on to. This is something that you share. And again, the Bible's way of saying, when should we be talking about these things? All the time. It's not just, the Sunday mornings kind of a thing. It's all the time. And then comes words about warning. For example, I'll read verse 10 and following. When the Lord your God has brought you into the land that he swore to your ancestors. And by the way, listen in here, see if you hear anything. To Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to give you a land with fine, large cities that you did not build, houses filled with all sorts of goods that you did not fill, hewn cisterns that you did not hew, vineyards and olive groves that you did not plant. And when you have eaten your fill, take care that you do not forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. The Lord your God you shall fear, him you shall serve, and by his name alone you shall swear. Do not follow other gods, any of the gods of the peoples who are all around you, because the Lord your God, who is present with you, is a jealous God. The anger of the Lord your God would be kindled against you, and he would destroy you from the face of the earth. Now, that last little phrase is often what people hear, and they think, man, why? God's really mad in the Old Testament. And then, of course, they're missing what's being spoken. But what else did you hear? Anything else jump out at you? I'll read one verse again. I'll read verse 13 if you want to follow with your eyes. The Lord your God you shall fear, him you shall serve, and by his name alone you shall swear. Any lights? Any lights? I'll read something to you. Let's see here. Let's see. Then the devil led him up and showed him in an instant all the kingdoms of the world. The devil said, to you I will give their glory and all this authority, for it has been given over to me, and I can give it to anyone if I please. If you then will worship me, it will all be yours. Jesus answered, it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve only him. Okay.
Is that in Matthew or?
Well, it's in Luke or Matthew. Matthew and Luke 4. Yeah, it's one of the places for that when we get to the Gospels. Matthew 4, Luke 4, both have the temptation of Jesus in there. But so Deuteronomy 6:13 is one of the passages that Jesus quoted when he was in the wilderness. Interesting, again, the connection in the wilderness, right? But here's this cautionary language against disobedience. Verse 16 says, do not put the Lord your God to the test as you tested him at Massa, right? Jump from the temple because he'll give his angels charge of you. And Jesus says, it is written, do not put the Lord your God to the test. I mean, here it is, right? So Deuteronomy, big stuff, right? Diligently keep the commandments, his decrees, statutes, there are those words again, right? That he has commanded you to do what is right and good in the sight of the Lord, so that it may go well with you, and that you may go in and occupy the good land that the Lord swore to your ancestors to give you, thrusting out all your enemies from before you, as the Lord promised. And now look at this. When your children ask you in time to come, what is the meaning of the decrees and the statutes and the ordinances that the Lord our God has commanded you, then you shall say to them, we were Pharaoh's slaves in Egypt, but the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. The Lord displayed before our eyes great and awesome signs and wonders against Egypt, against Pharaoh and all his household. He has brought us out from there in order to bring us in, to give us the land that he has promised on oath to our ancestors. Then the Lord commanded us to observe all these statutes, to fear the Lord our God for our lasting good, so as to keep us alive, as is now the case, if we diligently observe this entire commandment before the Lord our God, as he commanded us, we will be in the right. Now take just that little paragraph and sort of etch it into your brain, and it will help you at least begin to understand why the religious leaders get so ticked off at Jesus, like when he breaks the Sabbath, as an example. And so it is a the law, and this is just something we have to kind of hopefully learn more about, how the law is the way living out the law is the way you live out your faith. And law, unfortunately, has such a restrictive sense in our use of the word. So the living out these statutes, ordinances, commandments, whatever you want to, they're described, that living this life that God calls us to live is how we show that God's our God. And that's just repeated over and over and over again. Somebody take chapter 7, verses 1 through, we'll take all the way 1 through 11.
Lord your God brings you into the land you are about to enter and occupy. He will clear away all nations ahead of you, the Hittites, the Gs, the As, the Canaanites, the Perizzites,
All of them.
Yeah, all of them. These 7 nations are greater and more numerous than you. When the Lord your God hands these nations over to you and you conquer them, you must completely destroy them. Make no treaties with them and show no mercy. You must not intermarry with them. Do not let your daughters and sons marry their sons and daughters, for they will lead your children away from me to worship other gods. Then the anger of the Lord will burn against you, and he will quickly destroy you. This is what you must do. You must break down their pagan altars and shatter their sacred pillars, cut down their Asherah poles, and burn their idols. For you are a holy people. You belong to the Lord your God. Of all the people on the earth, the Lord your God has chosen you to be his own special treasure. The Lord did not set his heart on you and chose you because you were more numerous than other nations, for you were the smallest of all nations. Rather, it was simply that the Lord loves you, and he was keeping the oath he had sworn to your ancestors. This is why the Lord rescued you with such a strong hand from your slavery and from the oppressive hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Understand, therefore, that the Lord your God is indeed God. He is the faithful God who keeps his covenant for 1,000 generations and lavishes his unfailing love on those who love and obey his commands. But he does not hesitate to punish and destroy those who reject him. Therefore, you must obey all these commands, decrees, and regulations I am giving you today. If you listen to these regulations and faithfully obey them, the Lord your God will keep his covenant of unfailing love with you, as he promised with an oath to your ancestors. He will love you and bless you. He will give you many children. He will give fertility to your land and to your animals. when you arrive in the land he swore to give your ancestors.
Okay, I'll
You-
stop you there. So here now start the blessings, right? And so we get some of those connections. But in that first part of chapter 7 is this strong wording about don't get mixed up with the foreigners who live in the land. Because if you get mixed up with them, you will get mixed up with their gods, right? Remember that as we read through these different texts and narratives, that we will find contradiction is too strong of a term, but we will find that I'll just use a weirder word, the placing next to each other of very different narratives, right? We read earlier that Moses married a Cushite woman, right? And the Cush traditionally is Ethiopia, which of course means Moses's wife was black. And if you ever have any African American friends, they'll be quick to point out some of these things that you or I might not see as readily. But you have later on, David becomes his grandmother, great grandmother is from Moab, right? There'll be so sometimes here it's warning you don't intermingle with foreigners, but we will later read about the intermingling of foreigners. Sometimes it does indeed, like when we get to Solomon, leads to all kinds of idolatry problems. But there's this, they bump into each other. It's not always easy to make sense of all these things, but that primary sense of the reason they're called to wipe out anybody who's been in that land already is because they're worshiping these false gods. And if you mix with them, your faith will become mixed, and that becomes a big problem. You see some blessings here for obedience, and that will continue. And and so we'll get some of those blessing passages. But again, if you got a chance to read through the whole book of Deuteronomy, you know there's way more curse passages than blessings, just sort of how it always seems to be. I'm going to skip you ahead to chapter 8 now, because in chapter 8, it's a wonderful chapter that warns them about forgetting. Somebody take the first 10 verses, and everybody's going to notice something when we hear them read verse 3. Go ahead, somebody.
Be careful to follow every command I am giving you today, so that you may live and increase and may enter and possess the land the Lord promised on oath to your ancestors. Remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years to humble and test you in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commands. He humbled you, causing you to hunger, and then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your ancestors had known, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Your clothes did not wear out, and your feet did not swell during these 40 years. Know then in your heart that as a man disciplines his son, so the Lord your God disciplines you. Observe the commands of the Lord your God, walking in obedience to him and revering him. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land with brooks, streams, and deep springs gushing out into the valleys and hills, a land with wheat and barley, vines and fig trees, pomegranates, olive oil, and honey, a land where bread will not be scarce and you will lack nothing, a land where the rocks are iron and you can dig copper out of the hills. When you have eaten and are satisfied, praise the Lord your God for the good land he has given you. Be careful that you do not forget the Lord your God, failing to observe his commands, his laws, and his decrees that I am giving you in this day. Otherwise, when you eat and are satisfied, when you build fine houses and settle down, and when your herds and flocks grow large, and your silver and gold increase, and all you have is multiplied, then your heart will become proud, and you will forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. He led you through the vast and dreadful wilderness, that thirsty and waterless land with its venomous snakes and scorpions. He brought you water out of hard rock. He gave you manna to eat in the wilderness, something your ancestors had never known, to humble and test you, so that in the end it might go well with you. You may say to yourself, my power and strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me. But remember the Lord your God, for it is He who gives you the ability to produce wealth, and so confirms this covenant, which He swore to your ancestors as it is today. Keep going.
Now, I'll stop you there. So, moving into that land, right? You get this land of all these things that are present. A reminder about how in the wilderness, your clothes didn't wear out, your feet didn't swell, these sorts of things. And then that verse 11 and following, don't forget, right? Because there's this great challenge when your belly is full, your memory can be empty. Whereas I like to sometimes say/confess, my prayer life is much more vibrant when I'm feeling scared or worried or hurting or in trouble or fearful for somebody else or whatever, right? When things are going smooth, when I'm just doing okay, everything seems to be right. It's just kind of human nature, isn't it? That we get to these places. And of course, you heard the man shall not live by bread alone, right? This is the third place where they are done. The other thing that's interesting, I think look again, just with your own way your Bible translates it, verses 17 and 18 are something worth remembering, right? Whatever we have, whatever we might possess, is not because we're so wonderful, but we have a God who has enabled us to do so. And again, if you forget, it's going to be bad. Now, some of you will have this day. Some of you will have today. For example, in verse 11 at the end, that's another word that's going to show up. This day, today, that kind of making it present there. There are more warnings about what's going to happen in chapter 9. I'll read a little bit. Hear, O Israel, you are about to cross the Jordan today to go in, and then that's not really today. But anyway, you're about to cross the Jordan today to go in and dispossess nations larger and mightier than you, great cities, fortified to the heavens, a strong and tall people, the offspring of the Anakim, whom you have heard it said, who can stand up to the Anakim? Know then today that the Lord your God is the one who crosses over before you as a devouring fire. He will defeat them and subdue them before you, so that you may dispossess and destroy them quickly, as the Lord has promised you. Now, you know what's coming in the story, and now think about Joshua and the Battle of Jericho, which really isn't a battle, right? They march around the city and the walls fall, right? I mean, this is the classic example of God working on their behalf. Verse 4, when the Lord your God thrusts them out before you, do not say to yourselves, it is because of my righteousness that the Lord has brought me in to occupy this land. It is rather because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is dispossessing them before you. It is not because of your righteousness or the uprightness of your heart that you are going in to occupy the land, but because of the wickedness of these nations, the Lord your God is dispossessing them before you in order to fulfill the promise that the Lord made on oath to your ancestors, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Know then that the Lord your God is not giving you this good land to occupy because of your righteousness. Notice third time, right? See, moms, if you say something more than once, you've got biblical precedence. Okay, because you are a stubborn people. Remember and do not forget how you have provoked the Lord your God to wrath in the wilderness. You have been rebellious against the Lord from the day you came out of the land of Egypt until you came to this place. And then comes a classic example if somebody want to pick up and read 8 through 14.
even at Horeb, you provoked the Lord to wrath. And the Lord was so angry with you that he was ready to destroy you. When I went up the mountain to receive the stone tablets, the tablets of the covenant that the Lord made with you, I remained on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. I neither ate bread or drank water. And the Lord gave me the 2 stone tablets, written with the finger of God. On them were all the words that the Lord had spoken to you at the mountain out of the fire on the day of the assembly. At the end of 40 days and 40 nights, the Lord gave me the 2 stone tablets, the tablets of the covenant. Then the Lord said to me, get up, go down quickly from here, for your people whom you have brought from Egypt have acted corruptly. They have been quick to turn from the way that I commanded them. They have cast an image for themselves. Furthermore, the Lord said to me, I have seen that this people is indeed a stubborn people. Let me alone that I may destroy them and blot out their name from under heaven, and I will make of you a nation mightier and more numerous than they. So I turned and went down from the mountain while the mountain was ablaze. The 2 tablets of the covenant were in my 2 hands. Then I saw that you had indeed sinned against the Lord your God by casting for yourselves an image of a calf. You had been quick to turn from the way that the Lord had commanded you. So I took hold of the 2 tablets and flung them from my 2 hands, smashing them before your eyes. Then I lay prostrate before the Lord as before, 40 days and 40 nights. I neither ate bread or drank water because of all the sin you had committed, provoking the Lord by doing what was evil in your sight. For I was afraid that the anger that the Lord bore against you was so fierce that he would destroy you. But the Lord listened to me that time also. The Lord was so angry with Aaron that he was ready to destroy him. But I interceded also on behalf of Aaron at that same time. Then I took the sinful thing you had made, the calf, and burned it with fire and crushed it, grinding it thoroughly until it was reduced to dust. And I threw the dust of it into the stream that runs down the mountain. At Taberah also, and at Massah, and at Kibroth, you provided the Lord to wrath. And when the Lord sent you from Kadesh Barnea, saying, go up and occupy the land that I have given you, you rebelled against the command of the Lord your God, neither trusting him nor obeying him. You have been rebellious against the Lord as long as he has known you. Throughout the 40 days and 40 nights that I lay prostrate before the Lord when the Lord intended to destroy you, I prayed to the Lord and said, Lord God, do not destroy the people who are your very own possession, whom you redeemed in your greatness, whom you brought out of Egypt with a mighty hand. Remember your servants, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Pay no attention to the stubbornness of this people, their wickedness and their sin. Otherwise, the land from which you have brought us might say, because the Lord was not able to bring them into the land that he promised them, and because he hated them, he has brought them out to let them die in the wilderness. So they are the people of your very own possessions, whom you brought out by your great power and by your outstretched arm.
Good. So again, this golden calf, right? And all of that followed, and it's like a second journey through. It's a Deuteronomy. It's not just a second giving of the commandments, but it's a second kind of narrative through those wilderness years, not always covering the same thing. But this is where you get this, their stubbornness, they're a stiff-necked people, but he keeps saying, don't fall back into those behavior patterns. And so he will, in chapter 10, make 2 more tablets, get that wooden box out of acacia wood, and they will continue on. And I'm going to pick you up in chapter 10, verse 12 through the end of the chapter. Somebody read that section.
So now, O Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you? Only to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and to keep the commandments of the Lord your God and his decrees that I am commanding you today. for your own well-being. Although heaven and the heaven of heavens belong to the Lord your God, the earth with all that is in it, yet the Lord set his heart in love on your ancestors alone and chose you, their descendants after them, out of all the peoples as it is today. Circumcise then the foreskin of your heart and do not be stubborn any longer. For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who is not partial and takes no bribe, who executes justice for the orphan and the widow, who loves the strangers, providing them food and clothing. You shall also love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall fear the Lord your God. Him alone you shall worship, to him you shall hold fast, and by his name you shall swear. He is your praise, he is your God, who has done for you these great and awesome things that your own eyes have seen. Your ancestors went down to Egypt 70 persons and now the Lord your God has made you as numerous as the stars in heaven.
Okay. Kind of cool, huh? Watch out. Here's where you get some of the first mentions of justice for orphans and widows and foreigners and migrants and strangers and alien, right? These kinds of language that still perhaps informs some of the decisions we need to think about and pray about and work through. And that this is God's gracious action and the call for them to live in light of the God whom they worship and serve. Look at somebody read chapter 11, the first 7 verses.
You shall love the Lord your God, therefore, and keep his charge, his decrees, his ordinances, and his commandments always. Remember today that it was not your children who have not known or seen the discipline of the Lord your God, but is you who must acknowledge his greatness, his mighty hand, and his outstretched arm, his signs and his deeds that he did in Egypt to Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and to all his land. What he did to the Egyptian army, to their horses and chariots, how he made the water of the Red Sea flow over them as they pursued you, so that the Lord had destroyed them to this day. What he did to you in the wilderness until you came to this place, and what he did to Dathan and Abiram, sons of Eliab, son of Reuben, how in the midst of all Israel and earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up, along with their households, their tents, and every living being in their company. For it is your own eyes that have seen every great deed that the Lord did.
They were children, right? Or at least they were under 20, but they have seen and experienced some of these things. Keep going, 8 through 12.
Keep then this entire commandment that I am commanding you today, so that you may have strength to go in and occupy the land that you are crossing over to occupy, and so that you may live long in the land that the Lord swore to your ancestors to give them and to their descendants, a land flowing with milk and honey. For the land that you are about to enter to occupy is not like the land of Egypt, from which you have come, where you sow your seed and irrigate by foot like a vegetable garden. But the land that you are crossing over to occupy is a land of hills and valleys, watered by rain from the sky, a land that the Lord your God looks after. The eyes of the Lord your God are always on it, from the beginning of the year to the end of the year.
Notice the rain. What's the promise? God watches over this land, right? You don't have to reach out to the so-called other gods. God is watching this, right? God's eyes are always on it from the beginning of the year to the end of the year, right? So it's this invitation to trust. Somebody else pick up 13 through 21.
If you carefully obey the commands I am giving you today, if you love the Lord your God and serve him with all your heart and soul, then he will send the rains in their proper seasons, the early and late rains, so you can bring in your harvests of grain, new wine, and olive oil. He will give you lush pasture land for your livestock, and you yourselves will have all you want to eat. But be careful, don't let your heart be deceived so that you turn away from the Lord and serve and worship other gods. If you do, the Lord's anger will burn against you. He will shut up the sky and hold back the rain, and the ground will fail to produce its harvest. Then you will quickly die in that good land the Lord is giving you. So commit yourselves wholeheartedly to these words of mine. Tie them to your hands and wear them on your forehead as reminders. Teach them to your children. Talk about them when you are at home and when you're on the road, when you're going to bed and when you're getting up. Write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates, so that as long as the sky remains above the earth, you and your family will flourish in the land that the Lord swore to give your ancestors.
Sound familiar?
So,
Right? It's a kind of, it's repeated again. It's over and over and over. Somebody take 22 to 25. Or keep going.
Okay. Be careful to obey all the commands I am giving you. Show love to the Lord your God by walking in his ways and holding tight to him. Then the Lord will drive out all the nations ahead of you, though they are much greater and stronger than you, and you will take over their land. Wherever you set foot, that land will be yours. Your frontiers will stretch from the wilderness in the south of Lebanon in the north, and from the Euphrates River in the east to the Mediterranean Sea in the west. No one will be able to stand against you, for the Lord your God will cause the people to fear and dread you as he promised, wherever you go in the whole land.
And then I'll read verse 26. See, I am setting before you today a blessing and a curse. The blessing, if you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I am commanding you today, and the curse, if you do not obey the commandments of the Lord your God, but turn from the way that I am commanding you today to follow other gods that you have not known. Right? There's another sort of classic Deuteronomy emphasis. 29, when the Lord your God has brought you into the land that you are entering to occupy, you shall set the blessing on Mount Gerizim and the curse on Mount Ebal. And you, as you know, they are beyond the Jordan, some distance to the west, in the land of the Canaanites who live in the Arabah, opposite Gilgal, beside the oak of Moreh. Well, I don't know how they're supposed to know that. They haven't gotten there yet, but they're supposed to know that. When you cross the Jordan to go in to occupy the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and when you occupy it and live in it, you must diligently observe all the statutes and ordinances that I am setting before you today. And if you look again at page 7 in your book, that is now the ending of the introduction to the Deuteronomic Law Code. But let's go now to our picture once again. So we'll do as we often do with these and kind of take them in bigger chunks. So here now, who knows what Moses looked like. And by this point, he probably didn't have colored hair. But we're being generous, right? Because when Moses dies, as you learn, he has 120 is the number that's used there. But here he is holding the covenant, and you see the 6 parts of the covenant, and you remember them, right? We have the preamble, the historical prologue, the stipulations, the preservation and rereading, the witnesses, and the blessings and curses. And notice even more so now, just from this little reading of about a third of Deuteronomy, we've got lots of talk about blessings in the land and the curses that will drive you forth from the land. And so you see that in the picture there. But that's this backdrop for this whole book. And in fact, Deuteronomy in many ways is a whole covenant with all of these parts appearing. Down here at the base of the picture is that original Mount Sinai, as I referenced. Up here is that shadow. So it's like Mount Sinai follows you, or Mount Horeb, as it's referred to here. Then all that took place there with God is always with us wherever we go. Just like with the tabernacle that is with them wherever they go. And then there's this big question mark on top of the land, because their keeping of the land is hinged to their keeping of the covenant. And then there's simply a long reference of, well, I guess there's Mount Sinai. So the land, and here, if you will, turn to page 5. These are the points of emphases. Lots of talk already about the land, and we'll get a chance to read through a little bit more. Obviously, at the pace we're going, we're not going to get to read every single part, but the prominence of the land, the land, the land. The Lord alone, no other gods, the Lord alone. We haven't come to this yet, but we're going to hit this in some of the subsequent reading that we're going to get to do. There's going to be one sanctuary or one place, and it's never named in Deuteronomy. But when it talks about the place that the Lord your God will cause his name to dwell, that this idea, even though in Exodus, even though in Genesis, we had the patriarchs worshiping in all sorts of different places, that wasn't a problem. But from the eyes of the Deuteronomist, that's who the writer is referred to. In the eyes of the Deuteronomist, there's one valid place to worship. Because if you allow worship to happen too many places, it's going to get out of hand. But if we centralize it, it's going to be there. There's going to be one sanctuary. Whoops. Then blessings and curses, and we've run into those. And then this sense of choose life today. And that is our pictures for this unit. But we still have some more reading to do. Let's jump to chapter 12. It's kind of where we're at. We're actually not jumping there. But you can see that according to page 7, starting in chapter 12 and going all the way through chapter 26 is what's referred to as the Deuteronomic Law Code. We're not going to read all of this, but chapter 12 is going to lift up that one place. Somebody can read verses 1 through 12.
These are the statutes and ordinances that you must diligently observe in the land that the Lord, the God of your ancestors, has given you to occupy all these days that you live on the earth. You must demolish completely all the places where the nations whom you are about to dispossess served their gods, on the mountain heights, on the hills, and under every leafy tree. Break down their altars, smash their pillars, burn their sacred poles with fire, and hew down the idols of their gods, and thus blot out their name from their places. You will not worship the Lord your God in such ways, but you will seek the place that the Lord your God will choose out of all your tribes as his habitation, to put his name there. You shall go there, bringing there your burnt offerings and your sacrifices, your tithes and your donations, your votive gifts, your freewill offerings, and the firstlings of your herds and the flocks. And you shall eat there in the presence of the Lord your God, and you and your households together, rejoicing in all the undertakings in which the Lord your God has blessed you. You shall not act as we are acting here today, all of us according to our own desires, for you have not yet come into the rest and the possession that the Lord your God has given you. When you cross over the Jordan and live in the land that the Lord your God is allotting to you, and when he gives you rest from your enemies all around so that you live in safety, then you shall bring everything that I command you to the place that the Lord your God will choose as a dwelling for his name, your burnt offerings and your sacrifices, your tithes and your donations, and all your choice votive gifts that you vow to the Lord. And you shall rejoice before the Lord your God, you together with your sons and your daughters, your male and female slaves, and the Levites who reside in your towns, since they have no allotment or inheritance with you.
Hear it? The place, the place. So all other spots. Okay, well, let's clarify that a little bit. Somebody read 13 and 14. Anybody waiting for a chance to read a short passage? Okay, I'll do it. Take care that you do not offer your burnt offerings at any place you happen to see, but only at the place that the Lord will choose in one of your tribes. There you shall offer your burnt offerings, and there you shall do everything I command you. However, goes on to say, whenever you desire, you may slaughter and eat meat within any of your towns, according to the blessing that your Lord your God has given you. The clean and the unclean and the clean may eat of it as they would the gazelle or deer. The blood, however, you must not eat. You shall pour it out on the ground like water. Nor may you eat within your towns the tithe or of your grain, or your wine, your oil, the first things of your herds and your flocks, any of your votive gifts that you may vow, your free will offerings or your donations. These you shall eat in the presence of the Lord your God at the place that the Lord your God will choose. You together with your son, your daughter, your male and female slaves, the Levite resident in your towns, rejoicing in the presence of the Lord your God in all your undertakings. Take care that you do not neglect the Levites as long as you live in your land, right? So there's this kind of calling that there's going to be one place, one place, one place. And then this section ends in verse 28. Be careful to obey all these words that I command you, so that it may go well with you and your children after you forever, because you will be doing what is good and right in the sight of the Lord. Then comes warning against idolatry, right? Or even more strongly in chapter 13, if prophets or those who divine by dreams appear among you and promise you omens or portents, and the omens or portents declared by them take place, and they say, let us follow other gods whom you have not known, let us serve them, you must not heed the words of those prophets or those who divine by dreams, for the Lord your God is testing you to know whether you will indeed love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul. The Lord your God you shall follow. Him alone shall you fear. His commandments shall you keep. His voice shall you obey. Him shall you serve. To him shall you hold fast. Who are you supposed to worship? You got it clear, right? But those prophets, those who divine by dreams, shall be put to death, right? So, and it says, thus you shall purge the evil from your midst. And it gets stronger than that, doesn't it? If anyone entices you secretly, could be your brother, your father's son, or your mother's son, could be your own son, your own daughter, your wife, could be your closest friend. Let's go worship other gods, right? I mean, this is where some of that really sort of, this gets to be tough reading, doesn't it? Right? You must not yield. It says, verse 8, show them no pity or compassion. Do not shield them. You shall surely kill them. Your own hand shall be first against them to execute them, and afterwards the hand of all the people. Stone them to death for trying to turn you away from the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Then all Israel shall hear and be afraid, and never again do any such wickedness. Do you got any pictures in your minds of what the religious leaders were trying to do with Jesus, right? I mean, this is, and so this is strong languages. Then, of course, it goes to whole communities, right? So one God. Then chapter 14, we'll talk about don't sacrifice your children, right? And these, or you know, things you shouldn't do, like cutting yourselves or having certain hairstyles or whatever, because this is what their neighbors are doing. There's just more descriptions here about clean and unclean animals, about the kinds of offerings that you shall bring. There's the sabbatical year, the year of Jubilee in chapter 15. It's talking also about redeeming livestock. The Passover, and chapter 16 will talk about the major festivals. You have the Passover, the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of Booths. Then you get different kinds of worships that you can't do. And it just starts going, and you can kind of see the list on page 7, where it talks about judges and kings and priests and prophets, and you've got those bullet points there that follow. The city of refuges, the conduct for holy war. But what I want to take you to, because we're getting down toward the end of our time, and since I referenced it early, the child sacrifice, the prohibition for child sacrifice is in chapter 18. But I want to take you to, I think it's 26. Let me look here. Yeah, chapter 26. Would somebody read verses 1 through 11?
When you have come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance to possess, and you possess it and settle in it, you shall take some of the first of all the fruits of the ground, which you harvest from the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you shall put it in a basket and go to the place that the Lord your God will choose as a dwelling for his name. You shall go to the priest who is in office at that time and say to him, today I declare to the Lord your God that I have come into the land that the Lord swore to our ancestors to give us. When the priest takes the basket from your hand and sets it down before the altar of the Lord your God, you shall make this response before the Lord your God. A wandering was my ancestor. He went down into Egypt and lived there as an alien, few in number, and there he became a great nation, mighty and populous. When the Egyptians treated us harshly and afflicted us by imposing hard labor on us, we cried to the Lord, the God of our ancestors. The Lord heard our voice and saw our affliction, our toil, and our oppression. The Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with a terrifying display of power, and with signs and wonders, and he brought us into this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. So now I bring the first of the fruit of the ground that you, O Lord, have given me. You shall set it down before the Lord your God, and bow down before the Lord your God. Then you, together with the Levites and the aliens who reside among you, shall celebrate with all the bounty that the Lord your God has given you and to your house.
So it's interesting how in that little declaration that begins in verse 5 and following, that it transforms from third person to first person. And there's another example of that remembering, right? My ancestor, he went down into Egypt, and the Egyptians mistreated us and brought us out. Keep going. Finish through verse 15.
When you have finished paying all the tithe of your produce in the 3rd year, which is the year of the tithe, giving it to the Levites, the aliens, the orphans, and the widows, so that they may eat their fill within your towns, then you shall say before the Lord your God, I have removed the sacred portion from the house, and I have given it to the Levites, the resident aliens, the orphans, and the widows, in accordance with your entire commandment that you commanded me. I have neither transgressed nor forgotten any of your commandments. I have not eaten of it while in mourning. I have not removed any of it while I was unclean, and I have not offered any of it to the dead. I have obeyed the Lord my God, doing just as you commanded me. Look down from your holy habitation from heaven and bless your people Israel and the ground that you have given us, as you swore to our ancestors, a land flowing with milk and honey.
Notice then how the offerings, the function and purpose of the offerings. On the one hand, they're given in gratitude for what God has done. in acknowledgement of how God has blessed us. But then they're also used to bless. They bless the Levite, specifically here. It mentions the Levite, the resident aliens, the foreigners, the orphans, the widows. And it even blesses the town, the community as a whole. So it's kind of cool to think about that still how our offerings are meant to be used and lived out, right? And we use a portion of the offerings that we give to do things that help and encourage others.
How do you know which ones you're still to be obeying today and which ones
Yeah,
you've thrown away?
good. Yep, good question. So what, and the answer to that will come when we get to Jesus. So you're gonna have to hang on to that question for a while. But the short answer is essentially what Christians do with all of these. I'll just use the Deuteronomic language. This is the decrees, the statutes, the ordinances, however your Bible translates them. Which ones are kept and are really what does Jesus do with them? And of course, the sacrificial, all the sacrifices that are made, that will end when the temple becomes destroyed. And so it becomes, you'll hear about the sort of three categories, maybe you could call it, of the law. There are those, what they call cultic laws, which are the worship laws pertaining to the existence of the temple. But of course, remember, the temple doesn't even exist at this point, and the temple won't exist in the narrative for some time to come. So that's why, again, depending on which way you read Deuteronomy, is it looking forwards in a predictive sort of way, or is it looking back at the story that's their story to see why we do what we do today? But you've got those laws that pertain to the worship in life in and around the temple. You've got those laws that pertain to their time and place, and then you've got the what you might call universal laws that would apply to all people across all times and places. And people will argue among what some of those are. But the short answer, if I can actually give one, is we look to see what Jesus did, right? So the dietary laws, when we get to Mark, we'll see how it references Jesus setting aside the dietary laws. And so we don't follow the dietary laws. And some will argue when Jesus says, don't worry about your clothing, what you're going to wear. That sets aside all those, don't wear fabrics of different cloth. I mean, but this is the living debate that gets continued on through the life together. So hope that gets to some of your answers. They're going to be, this is sort of interesting, chapter 27 talks about writing all these laws down on stones when they cross over. And we'll see that happening in the book of Joshua. Let's see here. The blessings and curses, they're going to stand up on, half the tribes are going to be on one mountain slope, and the other half will be on an opposite facing mountain slope, and one side gets to read the blessings and one side gets to read the curses. And we'll see that played out. And then chapter 28. We will not read this together, but notice how the first 14 verses are blessings. And before I go too far down that, Deuteronomy and some of the books that we will read after this, certainly, I hope you will see how it can certainly set the stage for the belief that if I do this, God guarantees me this. And you're going to see that pattern play itself out, and especially when we get to Chronicles, which is a ways off. You're going to get, as you read through Chronicles, if you've ever read through Chronicles, As soon as a good person does something bad, boom. And then as soon as they stop doing bad, woo. And so this sets that kind of thinking of what some describe as a prosperity gospel. If you do this, God will bless you. So we got to be careful and again, weigh that out with the whole witness of Scripture. But certainly verse 28 says, if you keep the covenant, right? If you obey, if you observe, and commanding you today, right? There's that urgency of it being now. Here's these blessings, interesting, that shall overtake you, right? Blessed you'll be in the city. Blessed you'll be in the field, right? Blessed is the fruit of your womb, the fruit of your ground, the fruit of your livestock, the increase of your cattle, your basket, your kneading bowl. You're going out, you're coming in. I mean, all of this thing, bless, 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 bless. However, if you don't keep the covenant, not only are the things in those first 14 verses reversed, but all kinds of stuff. And depending upon the ability of your stomach to read nasty stuff, I would say to parents, please, 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 when you're threatening your teenagers, don't read from here. I mean, but there's some, I mean, really sort of horrid stuff, right? I mean, the most tender, gentle man who's so desperately hungry that he eats his kids and won't let anybody in the family have any, or the wife, right? The mother who bears the child. And I mean, it's just, yeah, it's bad stuff. And you have these curses that are spoken, and strong language.
One says the Lord will take delight in your ruin. That's
Well, right, but take this out, and here's where what's a good way to say it? I'm going to take you to a passage. Go to Hebrews chapter 10. And let's see here. Was it Hebrews chapter 10? Or am I missing? Yeah. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 31. I like to point out this verse, which in my translation reads, "It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God." I haven't had any confirmation student choose that passage as a life verse either. But I like to lift that passage up because it certainly counters the viewpoint that people sometimes come to or express, that the God of the Old Testament is a God of hate and wrath and violence. And the God of the New Testament is a God of love and mercy and grace. That those aren't true statements. And you have to wrestle and struggle with these passages that you just described. The Lord will take delight in your ruin, right? Why will the Lord take delight in ruin? Well, it's the ruin and the end of that wickedness and rebellion. When we get to Ezekiel, we will hear, and again, the prophets, I always forget to say this, so I'm sort of glad you referenced this. The prophets are, if not the remedy, they're the balm or the salve that gets rubbed over some of these things that we read in the other texts, because the prophets keep coming to the people saying, turn from your sin. The curses of the covenant are going to come if you don't. God doesn't want these things to happen to you, right? And so in Ezekiel, we'll get these passages that say, I take delight in the death of no one, says the Lord. Therefore, turn from your wickedness and live. And so you have to hold those things in tension. But a too simplistic answer is sin and rebellion against God is seriously bad stuff. And that passage we read a little bit ago where it talked about how, if your brother or your best friend or someone comes and says, hey, let's do this, forget God, let's do this instead, wipe them out, because that viewpoint they're espousing is deadly. But we don't have that sense sometimes so much. It doesn't get rid of the hardness here. And you just kind of have to sort of live with it. But let's look at just a couple of passages. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 30. This is something that will get picked up in the New Testament. Chapter 11 says, surely this commandment that I'm commanding you today, so this is chapter 30, verse 11, is not too hard for you. It's not too far away. It's not in heaven that you should say, who will go up to heaven and get it, so that we may hear it and observe it. It's not beyond the sea that you should say, who will cross the other side of the sea and get it. No, the word is very near you. It's in your mouth. It's in your heart for you to observe. See, I have set before you today life and prosperity, death and adversity. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I'm commanding you today, by loving the Lord your God, walking in his ways, observing his commandments, decrees, and ordinances, then you shall live and become numerous, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering in to possess. But if your heart turns away and you do not hear, you're led astray to bow down to other gods and serve them. I declare to you, you shall perish. You shall not live long in the land that the Lord your God, or that you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess. I call heaven and earth to witness against you that I have set before you death and life, blessings and curses. What's God want? Choose life so that you and your descendants may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying him, holding fast to him, for that means life to you and length of days, so that you may live in the land that the Lord your God swore to give to your ancestors, to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob. So the emphasis at the end is God wants us to choose life. As Deuteronomy kind of closes, there's sort of a closing speeches that we're a part of now, and it really ends with Joshua becoming Moses' successor, how they're called to kind of every 7 years have a rereading of the covenant. Joshua is given the charge. Moses is told he's going to die. And then it's interesting. Look at verse 24 of chapter 31. It says, when Moses had finished writing down in a book the words of this law to the very end, so there we have Moses in direct connection here, Moses commanded the Levites carrying the ark, say, take this book of the law, put it in the ark, can remain there as a witness, right? And then he says, verse 29, for I know that after my death, you will surely act corruptly, turning aside from the way I've commanded you. In time to come, trouble will befall you because you will do what is evil, provoking him to anger through the work of your hands. So it's kind of at the end of all this, Moses says, and I know I've said all this stuff to you, right? It's like the mom saying to the college student, don't go to the parties. It's there, but we have this song of Moses. We have Moses's death, his final blessing. And then chapter 34 is basically saying, and Moses died. God buried him. Nobody knows where the burial place is. And it ends with these words, verse 9, 34. Joshua, son of Nun, was full of the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him, and the Israelites obeyed him, doing as the Lord had commanded Moses. Never since has there arisen a prophet in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. He was unequaled for all the signs and wonders that the Lord sent him to perform in the land of Egypt against Pharaoh and all his servants and his entire land, and for all the mighty deeds and the terrifying displays of power that Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. So we've been journeying through and we get right to the edge of the promised land. And we have this pause in the book of Deuteronomy. And when we come back together next time, we'll jump in with Joshua and the conquest. I'll hang around at the end with if there are questions, but let's do our prayers together. I'll put them up here on the screen. And we can pray. Lord, make us instruments of your peace. Where there is hatred, let us sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is discord, union. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that we may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as in heaven. Give us today our daily bread. Forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. Save us from the time of trial and deliver us from evil. For the kingdom, the power, and the glory are yours, now and forever. Amen. Okay, so next time we get together, we will move to Joshua.